So we're going to look at a new type of looping statement called a for loop. We've looked at counting with a while loop, but because that's done so often, we've got a specific loop designed just for that, and it's called a for loop. The general format is we say for, some initial expression, some Boolean condition here, and then some update expression. So again, we looked at some counting for while loops, like if we want to count to 100 in a while loop, we might use a counter variable I, set it equal to 0 to start, and say while I is less than or equal to 99. And then inside our while loop, add 1 to I each time through. And we'll look at a for loop that's very similar to that. So our initialization stuff and our condition and our increment all fit into this one loop. Because again, we do this so often in while loops, we say some initial condition, and then while some expression is true, and then some increment. We specify that. I think a good way to kind of get used to for loops is to actually just write some and to practice, kind of play with them a little bit. So why don't you start up BlueJ and create a new a project. You can start with a new project. I've got this chapter 6 one open, so I'm just going to use that. But I'm going to make a new class, and I'm going to call this, we're just going to do some for loop samples. So I'm just going to call it for loop samples. You can call it whatever you want. And I'm going to open up that class. Now to give a little practice here, I'm going to leave this constructor. I'm going to delete this instance variable, sample instance variable at the top. Leave the constructor. I'm going to put my code in here in my constructor. There's a sample method here. I'm going to delete that. So what I'm left with is just my public class for loop sample with my bracket, and then my public constructor for loop sample here, same as this name. And then I can put my code inside my constructor. So this is what we're going to work with. And so let's write some simple loops here. So we'll start with, first we're going to declare an integer, int count. And I'm not going to initialize it right away because we will do that inside our for loop. So now my for loop is always for, and there's 3 expressions. My initialization, I'm going to count from 1 to 10. So I'm going to say initially I want count to be 1. And then my next expression is a Boolean, a true-false expression for when I want the loop to keep going. So I want to say as long as count is less than 10. And then now I'm going to do an increment. So I'm going to say count equals count plus 1. And that'll be my for loop. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this increment later on, but for now I'm just going to use that. So while count equals 1, so initially count will be set 1, while count, and we'll loop until count is, or as while count is less than 10, and then we'll do count equals count plus 1. And I'm just going to print out something. I'm just going to do system. So why don't you do the same thing, that out.println. And again, you can watch me do it, but if you actually do this, I think you learn better, and you can actually try out different things. So in loop. I'm just going to say in loop is what I'm printing out for now. So I'm going to compile this, see if I have any errors. Looks like I got everything right, got all my semicolons correct. Now make sure in your for loop, like if the while loop, never put a semicolon inside here. That will do what we call short circuit the for loop. So you never want that. Usually we put a semicolon after a lot of statements, but not after if statements or while loops or anything that starts with a bracket. So, but this looks good. Now I'm going to run this, and I can just create a new object of this type. Since I didn't create a main method, there's no main method to run. So I'm just going to create a new method, and it'll run this constructor. And here's what it prints out. It just says in loop, in loop, in loop, in loop. So even though I have in loop just once here, it's going to go through that and do it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. So it prints this out 9 times. So why don't you try to change this to do it 10 times. Right now it only does it 9 times from 1 to 9. So why don't you change this so it does it 10 times. So I'm going to try this less than or equal. So count equals 1, count less than or equals 10. Compile that and run that again. Create a new loop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So rather than counting these manually each time, let's print out the count as we go through this. So I'm going to go system.out in loop and count is, and then print out my count variable. So my count variable I'm going to print out each time through the loop. So it says in loop and count variable is 1, in loop and count variable is 2. And so you can kind of see, hopefully you can follow through the code how it's doing this. So we initialize count, so it sets up some variable for count. And then it says for count equals 1. So it sets count equal to 1 initially. And then it checks, is count is 1 less than or equal to 10? And if that's true, it goes into the loop. So it goes into the loop and it prints out in loop, and count is prints out 1 because count is 1. Okay, now we get to this end of a loop, and this is special. Now we do two things. First, we do our increment. Count equals count plus 1. So 1 plus 1 is 2, and so count is now assigned 2. So that's what we do here. And then we also check this. We check, is 2 less than or equal to 10? That's true, so we go back and do the loop again. So we say in loop and count is, and now this is going to print out 2 because count is now 2. And now we've hit the end of our loop and we do our two things again. We increment, count equals, or 2 plus 1 is 3, so count is now 3. And then we check, is this true? Is 3 less than or equal to 10? Yes, that's true. So we go and do our loop. So we print out in loop and count is 3. And then we'll do 4 and 5 and 6, 7, 8. Eventually count will be 8 and we'll print that out. We'll add 1, count will be 9 now, and we'll check, is 9 less than or equal to 10? Yes, we'll print out in loop and count is 9. And then we get to the end of our loop, we increment, 9 plus 1 is 10, count is now 10. Is 10 less than or equal to 10? Yes, I have less than or equal, so that's still true because of the equal sign there. So it prints out in loop and count is 10. And then it gets here and it increments 1. 10 plus 1 is 11. Count is now 11. 11 is 11 less than or equal to 10? No, that's false. So now we get out of our loop and go on to the other things. I can add some things here just so I know when I'm at the beginning of the loop. System dot print line. I'm going to say at start or before loop maybe. Starts. And I'm going to print another thing down here afterwards. Something like after loop ends. Just so I can kind of see that we're doing this, and then we get stuck in this loop, and we'll do this again and again and again, and eventually we get done and we'll do this. So we'll compile that, run that. So now it'll print out this before loop starts, and it counts the things, and after loop ends. So now try to change a couple things. See if you can change this so it goes from 0 to 9 rather than 1 to 10. The count goes. Because sometimes we want to start at 0 and sometimes we'll want to start at 1. So see if you can go from 0 to 9. See if you can go from 1 to 100. See if you can go to 1 to 100 by 2s. Can you go from 5 to 50 by 5s? Try out some different ones. So I'll walk you through. So why don't you just stop this and you can try out some. And then I'll walk you through some also, and you can very quickly after you try some out. Okay, so I'm going to try to go from 0 to 9. I could do this less than or equal to 9. One thing we write a lot is less than 10 because just the way our variables work out. A lot of times we say count equals 0 and count less than 10. So this will do it 10 times starting with 0. So I can compile that. Starts at 0 and goes to 9. In fact, I'm going to make copies of this. So I have a couple loops here. I've got a loop from 1 to 10 that we talked about. Talked about counting from 0 to 9. I say count less than 10 by ones. I'm going to do a loop from 5 to 50 by 5s, so by 5 each time. So I'm going to go for, and just to give you some variety, we don't always have to use the variable count. This time I'm going to use the variable I. So I'm going to say I'm going to declare int I, and then for I equals 5, that's where I'm going to start. I less than or equal to 50, that's where I'm going to end. And then I equals I plus 5, I'm going to go by 5 each time. And then I'm going to print this out, and then again my loop variable is I, so rather than using count here I have to use I. So you have to watch whatever, you can use whatever loop variable you want. A lot of people use the shortcut of I because they just want a short variable. I tend to use a variable like count or index or something like that I try to find more meaningful than I, but you can use whatever one you want. So again, I've got a loop that goes 1 to 10, another loop that goes 0 to 9, and then here's my loop that goes 5, 10, 15, 20, all the way to 50 for us. Now, you don't always have to go forward. You can create a loop that goes backwards. So see if you can have a loop that starts at 10 and goes to 1 backwards, kind of like the opposite of this. So see if you can create that. Okay, so I've started my loop here for, and again, I'm going to use I. I've got I declared up here for I equals 10. So I'm going to start at 10 and go to 0. So I'm going to ask, where do I want to start? I is 10, and how long do I want to go? So far, I've always said like count less than 10 or I less than or equal to 50. But now I want to go as long as I is greater than 0. Okay, greater than 0, greater than 1, or greater than equal to 1, greater than some number, because I'm starting at a large number, so I'm going to keep going as long as my counter is greater than my minimum instead of less than. Okay, right now I'm doing this wrong. I'm doing I equals I plus 1, so this isn't going to work. This is just going to go 10, 11, keep going forever, but let's just try that out. So I'm going to compile this, going to run this constructor, and I'll start counting forever. So a couple things. Eventually it'll stop when it rolls over integers, but that takes a long time. So again, I can go to my bar here and I can just reset the virtual machine and it'll stop my loop. Okay, so I don't want to do I equals I plus 1 each time. I want to do I equals I minus 1, decrement I each time. Compile this and run this again. So it looped from 10 backwards, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way down to 1. Okay, so you can try out different kinds of loops, experiment. You can use whatever variable you want in here, and you can loop forwards or backwards. So try out different loops. We'll want to be able to use different loops, and kind of as we specify, we say, oh, I want to loop from 1 to this number, or I want to loop from that number back to 0, or something like that. So practice these a little bit. Let's go back to zyBooks and see how we're doing. Okay, so we looked at this stuff. Now, one thing we want to talk about is this. Well, we'll talk about this plus plus and minus minus in just a sec. So there's some exercises here that you want to work with, and these are good practices to get you used to writing loops for this. Now, if you remember correctly when we were talking about while loops, the book likes to use this shorthand, plus plus I, to increment I. And they'll do this in the while loop, plus plus I. And that's fine. And a lot of people do that. And so you use minus minus I to decrement and plus plus I to increment This adds 1 and this subtracts 1 to it. But I find beginning programmers often kind of get confused by that. So I will tend to use this method where, and I suggest you might want to start. You can use either one, but I'll tend to use this count equals count plus 1, or I equals I plus 5, or I equals I minus 1. Something explicit like that. At least when you're beginning programming, I think sometimes that helps. So you can decide. You can either use the plus plus I, minus minus I for increment or decrement or not. Just be aware, you do have to be able to read these. So you will see them doing this plus plus I in the book. So be aware that that's the same as I equals I plus 1. Okay. So go through these exercises. Then we talk about when we use a for loop and when we use a while loop. So generally, anytime when we start the loop, if we can say we're going to do this loop 10 times or 4 times or X number of times, then we can use a for loop. And for loops are a little simpler, so we want to use them when possible. If we don't know inside the loop how many times we want to do it, we have to use a while loop. So for example, if we're looping and people are ordering Girl Scout cookies and they order a box of Girl Scout cookies and we ask them, do you want another box? And if they say yes, we go through the loop again. Now in that loop, we don't know how many times we're going to do that. So we have to use a while for that. Now, if we were to ask at the beginning, how many Girl Scout cookies do you want? And they would enter some value like 10. Okay, sorry for the short interruption. Like I was saying with the while loop, that works well for the Girl Scout cookies. But if we were to ask the user ahead of time, how many cookies do you want? And they said 4 or 10 boxes of cookies, then we could easily use a for loop, and we could say for I equals 1 to the number of boxes they want and loop through. So if you know at the start of your loop how many times, a for loop works really well. So again, there's some questions here that walks you through loops and some good practices here. So watch that. A common error, especially if you've been writing lots of while loops where you increment inside the while loop, or converting a while loop to a for loop, is make sure you don't increment twice. So you have in your for loop, you have an increment, I equals I plus 1 or plus plus I, and then so you don't want to do that in your loop body. That's built in. So by default, when the for loop gets to this closing brace, it'll go up here and do that, and then it'll check if this is true, and if it's true, it'll loop through again. Okay. Some nice challenge activities here that you can try out to print out different values. And again, we've looked at similar ones already, so these shouldn't be too hard to do. So that's our introduction to for loops. We will use for loops a lot. They're probably the most common loop out there, especially when we start working with arrays and different data structures. For loops are the mainstay of programming and repeated, because there's many times where we want to just loop through so many times. Loop through every pixel in an image, loop through every student in a class, loops through every customer, loops through every order, all this sort of stuff. So we'll use these for loops a lot. So